When we think of cocaine kingpins, names like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo come to mind. But few know about the man who supplied most of the cocaine they sold. His name was Roberto Suárez Gómez, known as the King of Cocaine. A man of power, corruption, and wealth. Suárez turned Bolivia into a narco state and left a legacy as one of history's most influential drug lords. But what makes his story even more fascinating is how it inspired the character of Alejandro Sosa from the iconic film Scarface. Health Wealth Diary presents the Roberto Suárez Gómez story, the real-life Sosa from Scarface.
And this is Roberto Suárez, the biggest drug dealer in the world. He is the boss.
Roberto Suárez Gómez was born on January 8, 1932 in Santa Ana del Yacuma, a remote town in the Bolivian lowlands. He came from a wealthy family that owned a vast cattle ranching operation. Growing up, Suárez learned about hard work and leadership, but he wasn't content with just raising cows. He had bigger dreams. In fact, his ambition would eventually overshadow anything his family could have imagined. In the 1950s and 60s, Bolivia was one of the poorest countries in South America. Political instability, poverty, and inequality were rampant. But Bolivia had one thing in abundance: coca leaves. For centuries, the indigenous people of Bolivia had cultivated and chewed coca for its stimulant effects, but the Western world was discovering a more sinister use for the plant: cocaine. Suárez recognized an opportunity. In the 1970s, as cocaine began flooding into the U.S. and Europe, Bolivia became a critical supplier of raw coca. Suárez saw the potential to industrialize the process, turning Bolivia from a mere producer of leaves into a cocaine production powerhouse. But this wasn't a solo operation. Suárez built relationships with Colombian traffickers, including the infamous Medellin cartel, headed by Pablo Escobar. Suárez married early, tying the knot with Ida Levy, a woman from a similarly influential Bolivian family. Ida played a significant role in Suárez's life, offering him support even as he ventured into increasingly dangerous and controversial enterprises. Their marriage was, by many accounts, a complex one, marked by loyalty, but also by the strain of Suárez's double life as a drug lord and family patriarch. The couple had several children together, and by all appearances, Suárez was a doting father. Despite the nature of his empire, Suárez maintained a facade of respectability for his family, portraying himself as a legitimate businessman.
Suárez supplies at least a third of all the cocaine entering the United States and seems untouchable at home.
Suárez wasn't just a cog in the wheel, he was the wheel itself. By the late 1970s, he had become the largest supplier of cocaine base to Colombia, supplying up to 70% of the world's cocaine. His operation transformed Bolivia's isolated coca fields into the engine driving the global cocaine trade. By the 1980s, Suárez was a billionaire, wealthier than some countries. He lived like royalty, hosting lavish parties on his massive ranch and wielding enormous political influence. Known as the King of Cocaine, Suárez was not just a trafficker. He saw himself as a businessman, even referring to his operation as La Corporación. But Suárez wasn't content with just making money. He wanted to reshape Bolivia. In 1980, during one of Bolivia's many military coups, Suárez financed a coup d'etat known as the Cocaine Coup. Led by General Luis Garcia Meza, the coup gave Suárez almost unlimited freedom to operate. Cocaine production exploded under his influence. However, Suárez's ambitions didn't stop there. In an audacious move, he offered to pay Bolivia's entire $3 billion national debt, yes, billion, in exchange for legal immunity. He claimed he wanted to save Bolivia and restore its economy. But unsurprisingly, the government rejected his offer, likely because it came with an unspoken price: total control. This aspect of Suárez's life is eerily similar to Alejandro Sosa in Scarface. In the film, Sosa is shown using his political connections to protect his empire, going so far as to order the hit of a journalist threatening his interests. Similarly, Suárez's wealth and influence allowed him to bribe officials, fund political campaigns, and maintain control over Bolivia's military forces. For both men, politics wasn't a hindrance, it was a tool. By the mid-1980s, Roberto Suárez Gómez was at the height of his power. His operations spanned continents, his wealth rivaled nations, and his influence reached into the highest levels of Bolivian politics. But every king's reign eventually comes to an end, and for Suárez, the walls began closing in faster than he could have imagined. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and the U.S. declared an all-out war on drugs. Crack cocaine was pouring into American cities, destroying communities and fueling a moral panic. Naturally, the DEA turned its sights on the source, Bolivia. And at the center of Bolivia's cocaine empire was Roberto Suárez Gómez. The Reagan administration labeled him a major target in their anti-drug crusade, calling him a narco-terrorist and urging Bolivia's government to crack down on cocaine production. With international pressure mounting, the Bolivian government had no choice but to act, even against someone as powerful as Suárez. Suárez, like Sosa, ruled his empire with an iron fist. Those who betrayed him or threatened his operations met swift and often brutal ends. Loyalty was a rare commodity in their world, and betrayal was never forgiven. Suárez had always relied on a network of bribes and alliances to protect himself. He had military generals, politicians, and police chiefs in his pocket. But as the DEA tightened its grip, those alliances began to crumble. Slowly but surely, Suárez's own associates started to turn on him, feeding information to the authorities in exchange for leniency or bribes of their own. One by one, members of Suárez's inner circle betrayed him. The DEA and Bolivian law enforcement now had actionable intelligence about his operations, his movements, and even the location of his safe houses. After months of preparation, the Bolivian military and DEA agents launched a coordinated operation to capture the king of cocaine. On July 20, 1988, they raided one of Suárez's heavily fortified ranches deep in the Bolivian countryside. The operation was swift and brutal. Suárez was taken into custody without much resistance. His once loyal guards and workers had abandoned him, leaving him to face his fate alone. It was the end of an era and the downfall of one of the most powerful drug lords the world had ever seen. While Suárez's real-life arrest lacked the explosive drama of Scarface's final act, the parallels are undeniable. Both men were brought down by their own ambition and the unforgiving nature of the drug trade. In the end, power and wealth couldn't protect them from their enemies, or themselves. Suárez's arrest was a massive victory for both Bolivia and the U.S. But his trial was less about justice and more about spectacle. The Bolivian government, eager to prove they were serious about combating drugs, made an example of him. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for drug trafficking and other related crimes. In prison, Suárez maintained his defiance. He insisted he wasn't a criminal, but a businessman, claiming he had simply supplied a demand that others created. He even wrote letters to newspapers, accusing the Bolivian government of hypocrisy and corruption, stating, "The government labels me a criminal, yet they took my money and turned a blind eye to my operations for years. Who is the real villain here?" By the 1990s, Suárez's influence had completely faded. His empire had been dismantled, his wealth confiscated, and his allies either dead or imprisoned. While other drug lords like Pablo Escobar continued to dominate headlines, Suárez became a forgotten figure, a relic of the cocaine trade's early days. After serving nearly half of his 15-year sentence, Roberto Suárez Gómez was released from prison in 1996. By then, the king of cocaine was no longer a king, but a frail man in his mid-60s, a shadow of his former self. One of Suárez's priorities after his release was reconnecting with his family. His time in prison had estranged him from many of his relatives, but those who remained by his side described him as a man who, despite his past, still cared deeply for his loved ones. He spent his final years in quiet seclusion, rarely appearing in public and avoiding the spotlight that had once been his domain. Freedom, however, was short-lived. Years of stress, imprisonment, and an extravagant lifestyle had taken their toll on Suárez's health. He suffered from various ailments, including heart problems and complications from diabetes. On July 20, 2000, exactly 12 years to the day after his arrest, Roberto Suárez Gómez passed away in Santa Cruz de la Sierra at the age of 68. Though his death barely made headlines, Suárez's legacy lived on in the cocaine trade he helped create. His methods, connections, and innovations in trafficking became the blueprint for future cartels. In many ways, Suárez wasn't just a drug lord, he was the architect of an industry. In the world of Scarface, Alejandro Sosa was a fictional character, but in the real world, Roberto Suárez Gómez was the man who lived it, a king of cocaine, a master of politics, and ultimately, a victim of his own ambition. What are your thoughts on Roberto Suárez Gómez? Let us know in the comments below, and also let us know what other stories you'd like us to cover from the world of crime, history, or pop culture. So please like and share my videos, and don't forget to subscribe to The Health Wealth Diary.